Welcome. I'm Bertram de Souza, veteran Mahoning Valley journalist and host of the Scribbler podcast. Today's episode was prompted by a billboard on Gypsy Lane that reads, "Number of anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S. in 2024, 9,354. The billboard is sponsored by the Jewish community. The episode was also inspired by the following recent statement from Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born leader of the Roman Catholic Church. Quote, "And so I, too, confirm that the Church does not tolerate antisemitism and fights against it on the basis of the gospel." A backdrop for today's discussion are the anti-Semitic text messages exchanged between Republican Party insiders that referred to Hitler and even joked about gas chambers. So what's driving this rise in anti-Semitism, not only in America, but in Europe and other parts of the world? My guests today are two individuals who have spent many years building bridges between people of all races, colors, and creeds. Bonnie Bertram is a well-known vocal leader in the Jewish community locally and nationally. Scott Schulich, whose involvement in numerous community and grassroots organizations has been widely recognized and praised, is a leader in the Catholic Church. We will be doing another podcast that focuses on Islamophobia and the rise of Muslim hatred, not only in America, but in Europe. All right, thank you, Bonnie and Scott, for joining me in a discussion of what has become in my opinion, a global epidemic of anti-Semitism, or to put it more crudely, hatred of Jews. But before I begin, I'd like each of you to tell us a little about yourselves, and especially your efforts in building bridges between peoples and religions, because I know both of you have known you for a long time. So Bonnie, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Bertram. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, I came to this work, through a non-traditional way. I am not originally from Youngstown. I grew up in New York as a pretty secular Jewish person, but in an area of the country where it was very easy to be Jewish. I got married to a man from Youngstown and moved here, and I'm a lawyer by training, hadn't practiced for a long time, but started practicing law. But I always had an interest in public affairs, community relations, and coming here and trying to understand the Jewish community here and truly understanding Ohio in many ways is what brought me to the work that I do. And for almost the past 30 years, I've been working for the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation as the director and now executive director of community relations and government affairs. And in that role, by definition, it's to relate to the community. Right. And so interfaith work has been a key component of the work that I've led. Social action and social justice work, which you do in coalition with other partners around the community, including, of course, the Catholic community. And we've done a lot of work with the diocese on many, many issues. That is part and parcel of who we are and what we do. And as a minority community, it is so crucial to work in coalition with other groups because oftentimes we can't do it alone. And in order to uphold the values that we uphold, and we're very proud of the values that we uphold, we need to work in concert with other groups. And, as we start to talk about these really difficult issues of the day, we are feeling more alone. And that's the challenge that we're currently facing.
Scott?
Well, I've spent most of my time career-wise in the financial services industry, but a lot of the work I think that probably brings me here today is some of the community work I've done through my involvement, in a variety of civic organizations. In my profession and in my civic work, I run across a lot of people from a lot of different cultures and backgrounds and religions. And I think if you're to be successful in your professional life when you're dealing with the public, just as Bonnie mentions about, that interface with the public and the work that she does, you've got to be sensitive to people's different political views, their religious point of views, their cultural point of views, their ethnic point of views, and somehow navigate through all of that to serve them And I think people have common issues and common problems that transcend all of those other issues, but we tend to focus on these particular issues. As we get into this conversation later on, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more, but I think in my background, where I gained a lot of perspective on people who were different than me was during both my high school experience and my college experience, where I encountered people for the first time that were different than me, from a different neighborhood, from a different religious background, or from a different culture. And, I think to understand that and come to learn that at a young age, it serves you very well as an adult to deal with lots of people and lots of different situations. So, and I think, Bonnie and I are both part of Rotary Club. And Rotary is very much about serving humanity around the world.
Internationally, yes.
Right. And international understanding. And, we work hard at that in our work as members of Rotary, but in the work that we do to try to bring people together, not bring them apart. So I think, like the two of you, I'm appalled by what I've been seeing that just hasn't happened overnight. I mean, this has been going on and building for years.
And as I said in my introduction, this podcast was prompted by a billboard on Gypsy Lane that states there were 9,354 anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S. last year. And coincidentally, Pope Leo XIV recently reiterated that the Catholic Church does not tolerate anti-Semitism. So, Bonnie, to kick off, I'd like to ask you to define Judaism, Zionism, and anti-Semitism. And the question that I've been asked in discussions is, do you have to be a Zionist in order to be a faithful Jew?
Well, there's a couple of loaded points in those questions.
Go ahead, take your time.
You premised the question by referencing the billboard, and I just want to be clear that they weren't all attacks; those were incidents. I'm not going to minimize the fact that Jews have been victims of attacks over the last several years, several decades, and several millennia. But in that particular instance, the billboard is referring to situations, instances, not only attacks.
But honestly, if in an incident, if you're an individual and you fear for yourself,
absolutely,
it's absolutely an attack.
I've been have been a victim in some way, shape, or form. But so your first question was defining Judaism, and we're gonna, say up front, I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a clergy person. I work for what is ironically known as a secular Jewish organization. I am a Jewish person. I was raised Jewish. My Judaism is part and parcel of my identity and who I am. But being Jewish is, easiest explanation is, of course, it is a faith, the Jewish faith. We all understand what that means. Most of us adhere to some faith of some kind, so we understand that piece of it. But in addition to the faith, being Jewish is also being part of a people. We are a peoplehood. We are a member of a tribe. We don't have the same kind of ethnic background or attachment to an ethnicity the way others do. And the way I sometimes describe it is I think back to my middle school and high school days growing up in New York. And I grew up in a town where everybody I knew was either Jewish or Catholic. There were a couple of Protestant kids in the corner that I didn't know too much about. And like you, Scott, I think I opened up and got a lot more of a worldview when I first went to college. But on, historically on St. Patrick's Day, a lot of the Irish kids in the Catholic community would come out and they would celebrate. And many of the kids would wear, "Kiss me, I'm Irish" buttons. And it became a source of pride. And over time, people started wearing more buttons. "Kiss me, I'm Italian." "Kiss me, I'm Polish." And "kiss me," and fill in the blank. And I kind of thought to myself, and I still remember this, what do I get to wear? I have no comparable ethnic identity. And eventually the "Kiss Me, I'm Jewish" buttons came out. And that's because we're a people in addition to being a faith. And there's a sense of that peoplehood. And we take a lot of pride in our peoplehood. And we work very hard to maintain that Jewish peoplehood. both through application and practice of faith, and and also through application and adherence to our values. And we want to share those values with the world. And I'm going to put something out right up front, because we get accused of saying what I'm about to say in a very pejorative way, the notion of Jews being the chosen people. That has nothing to do with us believing we are better than anybody else. The notion of us being chosen is because we were chosen by God to study, teach, and transmit Torah. Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And those outline the values of life that we all live by. That's it for being the chosen people. Oh. In terms of anti-Semitism, you already outlined it. It's hatred of Jews. It is the world's oldest form of hatred. It has been going on for millennia. Jews have always been the outsider in any community, and yet we continue to strive. We continue to thrive. There's another old joke about every Jewish holiday that we commemorate. You know, in order to sum up what these holidays are about, people often say, they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. And we still kind of joke about that today, but that's really what many of the historical events that have become Jewish holidays. Hanukkah is one of those holidays. Mm-hmm. Hanukkah is reminding us of a situation, the first time in recorded history for a successful revolt for religious freedom, period. It's not the Jewish Christmas. It has nothing to do with everything else that is commemorated and celebrated during the December season. Zionism is very simple. It is the belief in a Jewish homeland. Mm-hmm. It is the repopulation of a state for Jews in our indigenous homeland. Period, full stop, nothing else. And a Zionist is somebody who believes in the Jewish state. Anything else that's attached to that term becomes an obnoxious pejorative that is fueling the current anti-Semitism we're seeing here. And the last thing I'll say on just this question, because I know we're going to get into it more, is anti-Semitism evolves. It's kind of like, you know, those who adhere to a more evolving notion of the U.S. Constitution. It starts one way, but society transforms it. And so when one form of anti-Semitism doesn't work, another one picks up and takes hold. It's like whack-a-mole. Our job right now, my job right now, and all the people that represent Jewish communities, stand up against anti-Semitism is harder now than it's ever been.
And we really will get to that. Scott, Pope Leo's condemnation of anti-Semitism comes on the 60th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council that adopted Nostra Aetate. Could you explain what this and why it is significant in terms of the relationship between the Catholic Church or the Catholics and Jews?
Well, I mean, let's go to the very premise of Catholicism. I mean, Jesus was born a Jew. His parents were Jewish. His grandparents were Jewish. He was raised as a practicing Jewish person, both culturally and from a religious perspective, and died as a Jewish person. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think that people often forget that Christianity and Catholicism are rooted in the Jewish background, the Jewish faith. I think what Bonnie said about those first 5 books of the Bible holds true. I mean, those are things that we learn in Catholic grade school or in CCD, whatever the case might be. So, I mean, every week at a Catholic liturgy is a reading from the Old Testament and then a reading from the New Testament. So, I mean, so many of our Catholic Christian traditions, a lot of the symbols in the Catholic Church date back to the Jewish heritage. So I think that's why it is so significant. And there has been a dialogue. I mean, obviously, as the Pope points out, there have been misunderstandings. There have been, times when relations might have been strained. But I think over, at least this last 60-year period, the Council opened up, ecumenical dialogue. Yes. Not just with Jewish people, but with lots of other ancient Protestant religions and things like that. and I think Catholics too, just like Jews, have been persecuted over the years.
Sure.
Maybe not the same kind of publicity in the same way, but look, a couple of months ago, we see a shooter come in to a Catholic church and shoot children and people in a Catholic church. In the Middle East, we see the decimation of Catholic churches and Christian communities where priests have been killed celebrating Mass at the altar, where we experience the anti-Catholic issues, hate crimes, if you will, in many of the same ways that we see anti-Semitism. So I think even in that we're connected, because we're among hated Christians, and especially among many extremes in all of these religious areas today. Catholics have become a similar target as Jews have, I think.
But it is true that after the reign of terror by Hitler, where 6 million Jews were exterminated, there seemed to be a sort of a recognition of the inhumanity that occurred. And for a while, thoughtful people decided that, this cannot continue again. This cannot happen again. It should not happen again. And I used to cover memorials at the Jewish Community Center where they would talk about that. But now it seems to be that understanding of what occurred during Hitler's time doesn't matter anymore. And so what I'm interested in finding out is what's driving this intolerance of Jews in not only in America, but in Europe and in other parts of the world.
Well, we don't have enough time to really talk about it all in depth, but there are some easier rudimentary answers to that question. So, again, if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, you look at the history of Jews as the other, if you look at the history of people who have a problem, and you see that even today, they don't look inward to solve their problem. They're always looking outward. Mm-hmm. Who did this to me? Mm-hmm. And Jews have clearly been the scapegoat throughout the millennia on this particular, when answering that particular question. And you've seen that throughout all time. I think specifically to your question about the Holocaust and the immediate aftermath, it was such a horrific moment in history, an unbelievable moment in history, particularly because it took place in the 20th century when there was already, there was technology to document it. It wasn't something that happened in ancient days where something could occur on the other side of the world and nobody would know about it until maybe, it was such, long past history. The fact that it happened when it did, and the fact that it happened with a learned society, mm-hmm. a Western mm-hmm. society of intellectuals who bought into this concept, it was beyond the pale of understanding. And humanity recognized that shortly thereafter. So now we're starting to see what I referred to before, the evolution of anti-Semitism. And the questioning, well, it really wasn't so bad, for the Jews back then. Or they're just exaggerating it because they're looking to make themselves more victims. Or they're using the Holocaust as part of their evil plan to take over the world and control the media and control the banks and all the anti-Semitic tropes that are out there. And it's very easy, in our current society when it comes to social media and the fact that people live in their echo chambers of what they're being fed on social media and what they're playing into. It's easy for people to see this stuff and it validates their already existing biases, their existing hatred of the other, or the hatred of who they see as causing their problems. It's a very simple answer to a very difficult question, but I think that's, at least getting at the root of what we're facing now. And I know we're going to talk about how do we combat it, but it's really not there's no easy answer to that one. But again, we'll talk more about that as well.
Honestly, when I knew and learned about and in college and all about the Holocaust and all of that, But it's not the same as when you go and actually visit the concentration camps like
No.
Cindy and I did. And you can actually, the silence speaks volumes, because as you walk through, you hear, it's your mind playing games, obviously, but you really hear what occurred. You hear the cries, you hear, and it changes you. I mean, after we left, we didn't say anything to each other for a long time, because we were just so, taken by that.
You can't. And I will tell you, we're at the point in history where we're getting to the end of the first, the lives of the first-hand witnesses of what happened. Yeah. Whether they be survivors of the Holocaust, whether they be liberators who saw firsthand when they went into the camps and liberated those who were in prison, or anyone else who was there at the time. And so it becomes our jobs, not just my job at the Jewish Federation, but all of our jobs to continue to talk about and learn about this history. And we've actually made that a priority. And one of the things we're starting to see, and we work very closely with teachers, we send area teachers to Poland to see the camps firsthand, and they experience it for themselves. And as a result of that, they're starting to teach these issues in the classrooms when the state has made it very difficult for them to teach about it because of standards and tests and all kinds of things. So, but what we're hearing from the teachers is not only do the majority of their kids not know about the Holocaust, or they've never heard about the Holocaust until it's introduced into the classroom, but they're coming from homes where, well, the Jews don't matter, or they're just exaggerating it, or it didn't really happen the way they're saying it. To the point where we've had teachers tell us they've had students who they weren't sure were going to be allowed to come hear a presentation by a Holocaust survivor because their parents wouldn't sign the permission slip for them to come hear the survivor. And that's what we're facing now. And how do you change that? I don't know. Step by step, person by person, school by school, young person by young person. That's what we're facing now when it comes to this broad-based hatred. And as Scott pointed out, it's not just against Jews. That hatred is out there. The hatred of the other is so prominent.
It's almost become acceptable. As you were talking about, there's this religious hatred. But as an immigrant, this idea that I came here and took somebody's job, or I came here.
I don't know how many people would have wanted to.
That's why
they kept me around. Nobody else wanted it.
Right.
But the fact that immigrants are coming in here and taking American jobs, immigrants are coming here, it's just this drum roll, constant. The Pope was unequivocal in his statement about the Church not tolerating antisemitism. So, as a staunch Catholic, and I'm sure you won't mind me calling you a staunch Catholic, what is your reaction when you hear these vile, or hear and read these vile and obscene comments about Jews on the internet?
Oh, well, it's horrific, and I tend to agree with what Bonnie said. I think it all boils back to education. The experience of perhaps visiting a camp if you have the luxury to travel and do that, but hearing survivors, learning about the Holocaust. Think back to your grade school history book. Maybe World War II was a chapter, and inside that chapter was a section on the Holocaust, but nothing in depth. When I was in high school, I took a world religions course, even though I went to a Catholic high school. And, in college, I actually took a course on Judaism. I wanted to learn about other religions, particularly ones I didn't know as much about. But I also grew up in a household. My grandmother worked for a Jewish company, the Schwebel Baking Company, for 20 years in the front office.
Oh, okay.
So, I had a sense of, Jewish people, the Jewish faith, their struggle, but also beyond that, I grew up in an environment where you were taught about people who were different, the others, and how you treat people who are different. And I'm not sure people raise their children the same way that maybe we were all raised, and in households where tolerance was preached and practiced and promoted. And I think that's what shapes you. But taking the time to learn, whether it be involuntary through what is taught in textbooks, or voluntary when you are of an age where you can say, I want to learn something that's different, or I want to learn about different people. Not everyone has the motivation to do that, but I think for those of us who have, that's how you get beyond a lot of this. And when you cringe when you see these anti-Semitic activities, these hate crimes, whatever they may be, because it's not the way I was raised, it's not the way you were raised, and you wonder what is happening in homes. When you have parents who won't sign permission slips to hear a speaker. I mean, those are the kinds of things that you want. I would think you'd want your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews to learn about, so that it doesn't happen again. To watch movies about the war, to read books about the war, and even though they may be a little bit Hollywood, you still are learning about what happened. I mean, I think Schindler's List comes to mind as that movie for many people who weren't Jewish to really understand maybe what occurred, or what happened, or the Diary of Anne Frank. Books that young people have read for decades after the war. But I think I worry, like Bonnie, that time erases this memory, and as we move into losing the World War II generation, and people tend to forget history. I mean, people tend to forget already what's happened during 9/11, 25 years ago. And, you see all of these things unfolding in our world, and I worry exactly like Bonnie does that, World War II is something that is like the Civil War to us. We don't have any connection. We don't know what it was like to live in the North and the South in the 1860s. Well, there's a whole generation of people who don't have grandparents to tell them what happened during World War II, like we did, parents or grandparents.
And it's easy to be insensitive, even if you're a thoughtful person. And I recall when I was writing about the mafia, the mobsters, and one of the things I loved doing was using their nicknames. I caught Cadillac Charlie and all of that. So one of the mob bosses in the area was a Jewish person by the name of Bernie Altshuler, and his nickname was Bernie the Jew. So every time
I was so mad at you back
then. I know, not only you. Every time I'd write about him, I'd write, Bernie the Jew Altshuler. And I'd get a chuckle because I'd write about, all the other mob bosses, and I'd use their nicknames. So I was at Kravitz Deli one Saturday, and I was coming out, and a Jewish lawyer, prominent one, saw me, and I said hello to him. And I've known him I knew him a long time, and he says to me, he says, I've always enjoyed your columns, and I always enjoyed what you write, and I like your bravery and all. He says, but I'm going to tell you this. I find it very offensive that you keep referring to Bernie the Jew. He says, not because it's not right, that's his nickname. So, but it feeds into the perception of a Jew being somewhat, underhanded, or a perception of the Jew being, somewhat below whatever society. And he says, why would you do that? And I was driving home and I thought, well, to hell with him. I put everybody's nickname in my columns. They're fine. People like to read it. But the next time I wrote about him, I made the effort not to use his nickname.
Okay.
And the reason being, it's not because, Cadillac Charlie is not offensive. The guy drove a Cadillac. But to actually focus on the Jew part feeds into that perception. And I stopped. And I think that's what needs to be done more in society. But in addition to what's happening, not only the hatred for not only Judaism, but Catholicism and all of that, in addition to the rise of anti-Semitism in America and Europe, there is also the rise of Catholic nationalism. First of all, I am a Roman Catholic, and my Catholicism goes back to St. Francis Xavier going to India. So it's deeply rooted. Does it worry you, Bonnie, that here in the US, for example, there are a growing number of Republicans and even Democrats buying into this idea that America is a Christian nation. And it struck me more than recently Vice President J.D. Vance, who converted to Catholicism as an adult, is married to a woman who's a Hindu. And he recently made the comment that he hopes his wife would convert to Christianity. Talk.
Yeah, so lots of loaded questions. And I do want to, kind of reiterate your point for a second. I will answer that question about Bernie Altshuler. And you're absolutely right. And I'm glad to hear you talk about how the perception is. And if you think about the other nicknames, look, the reason he probably got that nickname, and I did not know Bernie, I know a lot of people who did know him very well, right. But I'm sure the reason he got that nickname is because he was the outsider, yes. And he was the Jewish yes. person in the crew. And I'm not going to lie, I've had family members who I've never met, but a cousin of my grandfather on my mother's side was connected and ran in Meyer Lansky's crew way back in the day. So, I mean, there's all kinds of connections right. there. But I'm going to share one story that was very, very frustrating. And if you remember when Mickey Momus had his yes. issues, yes. and we're not going to go into all of that. I mean, Mickey did what he did, and he went away for them. And, the justice system did what, played itself out. But his local rabbi, was sought out by the media looking for comment on Mickey Momus's actions. Right. And I started to think back then, who else would have been subjected to that? Are there there were Catholics who were involved in the mafia. Were there any media representatives that went to the bishop at that time looking for comment on what somebody who happened to be Catholic and was accused of a crime had done? That had nothing to do theoretically exactly. with their Catholicism. It shouldn't. If that person was guilty of committing right. crimes, then let the justice system deal with them. And if they were basing those crimes on whatever they were basing them on, that's individual and that's about the person. It's not about the group. And that's what Bernie the Jew, that comment, that description continued to do. It demonized and it gave space. Right. For that continued anti-Semitism to occur.
And let me add, as a Roman Catholic, yeah. mob bosses, the mafia, all being Catholic, were the greatest supporters of the Catholic Church locally. Joey Naples actually supported St. Anthony in Briar Hill. The mobsters gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church. So this idea that you go to the rabbi to get a comment about Mickey Momus, but you don't go to the bishop to talk about, hey, you're big supporters, of the mobsters are killing people. Lenny Strollo said, murder is just business.
Where that came from. So in terms of the current situation, right. yeah, so you mentioned about the right wing and you mentioned Republicans and Democrats. And I'm not going to comment specifically on J.D. Vance. Because if he's, the vice president is talking about his wife and their personal faith, and yeah, I know, he's the vice president. It's a little bit different than if an individual was talking about that.
Which is why I got
which is obviously. And let's face it, you put yourself out to be in public office, you're subjected to greater scrutiny than others who are not public-facing individuals. But the notion that this is a Christian country, that further... it further stresses the idea of anybody who doesn't, adhere to that Christian faith. And maybe, even a non-Catholic version of Christianity, mm-hmm. That those people are the other. And that's not what this country was founded on.
And in fact, if I may interject, I mean, we've always learned it's a country based on Christian ideals, not a Christian nation. I mean, right. there are many countries in Europe that were actually identified as Christian countries, by the crown or by... Yes. I mean, this is a country built on religious freedom, maybe with, some Christian ideals, but those Christian ideals that we talked about are shared in many ways, at least from the Old Testament perspective. And I think it's a shame that we would get away from the fact that, do unto others as you have them do unto you, or, that you would not take care of, those in need. turns into something much different. Those are universal values that maybe are definitely rooted in Christianity and rooted in Judaism, but they're about being good to people, being good to others.
The notion that they're universal is the key piece.
Right.
Because you don't have to be Christian, you don't have to be Jewish, you don't have to be a person of any faith to adhere to those values. That's being a good person.
Right.
And if you read the Declaration of Independence behind me, it doesn't say we are a Christian nation.
Right.
Yes, it definitely doesn't. So yeah, does this stuff concern me? Absolutely, because it is being morphed into political extremism in ways that we're seeing in so many arenas, and it is fueling the hatred and the anti-Semitism that's out there. And let's be clear, we can talk about anti-Semitism coming from the right. It's horrible, and the left wing will condemn that. We can talk about the anti-Semitism coming from the left, and the right wing will condemn that. What is crucial right now is for people in their own camps to recognize the evil from within. And we're not seeing that enough. And in terms of Jew hatred right now, we're getting it from all sides. And so I can be very critical of individuals, entities on the right. I can be very critical of individuals, entities on the left. It's not because of who they are. It's not because of the faith that they believe in. It's because of what they stand for and what they promote. And when you speak out against this stuff, it gets morphed into Islamophobia, it gets morphed into anti-Christianity, it gets morphed into anti-Americanism, it gets morphed into stuff that not only does it not solve the problem of hatred, it makes it worse. And it makes people like Jews and others, of course, but I'm just going to speak, from my own experience and from my own community, it makes us less safe. And that's why that billboard that you started this conversation about notes the amount of anti-Semitic instances during the last year, and they're running up, and the number is growing every day for 2025.
And I think the fact that in some circles that this extremism, this anti-Semitism is tolerated is what's even more disturbing.
And that's going to be my next question, because I'm sure both of you have read the recently published text messages among Republican Party insiders. And it shows a disturbing political trend, and I followed along. The text included admiration for Hitler and references to gas chambers in a joking manner. What is going on in this country where politics has become so coarse and even inhumane? Scott?
Well, I don't know exactly how we got here, but here we are. I mean, I think that we've lost, if I think back to conversations I've had through, recent years with friends who have different political points of view. I mean, I think what we've lost in the last several decades is the fact that we can have different political points of view. We can support different candidates. We can have a different view of the way government ought to operate. But we don't have to hate each other. I think back to, reading, Ted Kennedy's autobiography a few years ago, and, talking about how he and Orrin Hatch worked together and were best of friends and also best of colleagues, even though they were totally opposite in terms of their points of view, but they found a way to work together to get things done for the good of the American people and the good of Congress. And there are many examples of
Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan having a glass of scotch in the evening.
That's what we're missing, Bertram. I think today that, if I disagree with you politically, then you're outside my circle. And I hate you, I don't like you, I'm not going to talk to you, you're not invited over for pizza, whatever the case might be. And I think there was a time where political adversaries were friends and colleagues, and were working toward a common cause, even though they were coming from it from different perspectives. Now the perspective is not even respected. I mean, it's you either agree with me or you don't, and if you don't agree with me, then I hate you. And so if that's what happens in the political environment, of course that's going to spill over into religious, cultural, ethnic. I mean, go down the list of different kinds of people. And, if we can't get along for the common good of the American people in our political life, how are we going to do that in any other aspect of our life? And I think that's why we're seeing what we're seeing, that it's just that evolution that Bonnie points out is very true. I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't remember people hating each other over politics the way they do today.
And Bonnie, you've done this a long time. Did you ever think we'd be at this stage?
I always tell my younger colleagues, I have a number of younger colleagues around the country who have my job, who I mentor. And our job, as I said before, is harder now than it's ever been. But the other thing that's interesting about the work that I do, it's never the same. So what I did 30 years ago isn't necessarily going to be what I did 29 years ago or 20 years ago or 15 years ago or even 15 minutes ago. So you can never really predict. But did I ever think that my children would have to worry about outwardly expressing their Judaism? And at least one of my children took off her Jewish star shortly after October 7th. And she apologized to me because she felt almost guilty that she had to do it. She was at a university at the time and was afraid to openly demonstrate her Jewishness. She was fearful. And she's gotten through that, and she's out of school now, and she's fine. But I never in a million years would have thought that I would have to talk to my children about this kind of anti-Semitism and what's out there. I always thought I'd have to worry about racism and making sure that my kids didn't ever exhibit those things. Sexism, I have one daughter and two sons, and to teach my children about being respectful of all people. And I'm proud that both of my sons have actually had female bosses in the work that they do, and it's not a big deal. And I'm thinking, wow, we've really made some progress. And my daughter is strong in what she does, and I'm proud of her. Those are the things I used to worry about. Now I worry about my son who lives in New York and what's going to happen there. I worry about my other son who's living in Chicago, where, the politics is crazy. And I worry about my very liberal-minded daughter who lives in Austin, Texas, who's very happy that she lives in a little blue area, surrounded by a lot of red.
If you're going to live in Texas, live in Austin.
Right, but she's seeing the anti-Semitism there in ways that she's never experienced. And, it's a challenge. And I know, as someone who is a Jewish woman from New York, who married someone and moved to the Midwest and has now raised 3 Midwestern children. I kind of think about jokes all the time because my father was actually a comedian. My father was a Catskill comedian. So I try and make things funny as best as I can in my head. But my joke is, the only thing I regret about coming to Ohio and marrying a man from Ohio is that I've raised 3 Midwestern children who don't fully appreciate their New York Jewish roots. I try and teach them a little bit. But they're starting so those were the things I worried about. Yeah. Their Jewish identities and how they, saw the world. Midwestern values are wonderful. Youngstown and its surroundings has been a phenomenal place for me to raise our family. And we've been fortunate that I've been able to take my kids places and we can travel and I can teach them about the world. And that's what my husband and I have focused on. And I wish everybody had the ability to do that, or even if they do, made the effort to do that. And that's what we're seeing, and we're going to end up talking, I know, about social media and what has led to this, but that is part of the problem, is how people consume media today, how people consume information, how that information is pushed out to them. And the problem is caused by mainstream media, legacy media, biased media, the ones that actually recognize and overtly claim their bias, and then all the other non-traditional sources of consuming information online that have virtually no restrictions.
Well, and that's very true. I mean, we now tune into the channel that aligns with what we like or what we believe in, not because it's the news, because it's the cable news network that we most identify with.
It's the confirmation bias, and we all buy into it.
It's the things you like on social media, and we're all profiled then to get other messages about those kinds of things. And so we're not seeing the full view. We're getting the real news. It is biased. It is jaded. It is, painted a certain way. And I don't think that's good.
So when we wrap up, I will be asking each of you as community leaders to talk about how this rise in anti-Semitism should be addressed and hopefully reversed, including the influence of social media. But you mentioned New York. So the New York mayor-elect Zoran Mamdani, who came from Uganda, like I did, and who's a Muslim, a Democrat, has been forced to reassure Jewish residents that he is not anti-Semitic. His past comments about the Israel government's war in Gaza has led many to believe that he is anti-Jewish. He contends that criticizing the Netanyahu government and the way it has conducted the war in Gaza is not a criticism of Jews or Judaism, but is a political criticism. But yet there are Jews in New York who are worried about him, who are concerned of what a Mamdani administration is going to bring forth. Talk to me about that.
Okay, so first of all, he is correct in that criticism of the Netanyahu government and policies of the Israeli government in and of itself is not anti-Semitic. You can talk to half the Jews in Israel who are out there protesting,
yes,
have been protesting the Netanyahu government, who would like to see a change in the Netanyahu government, who have watched that government shift further to the right and have gotten more appalled at what they've seen coming out of the government. And when tens of thousands of Jews are out there protesting, when we get into, the Israel question, I always ask people, what happens to those people when they're done protesting? Well, they go home and have dinner with their families because Israel is a democracy and they get to do that. If the only thing that the mayor-elect has been guilty of is criticizing the government of Israel, I would be the first one to stand up and say that man is not anti-Semitic and we don't have to worry about him. And maybe we need to lobby him a little bit, and my colleagues in New York would be doing that. It would be a very different conversation than what we're seeing, but that is not what he has only stood for. He has stood for things that have been blatantly anti-Semitic, not just saying that he has a problem with the Netanyahu government. And one of the things he said, if you listen to him in his speech on election night, he talked about the beautiful mosaic of cultures in New York and the city now that he was about to take the reins of. And he talked about cab drivers and bodega owners and all kinds of people who love their culture, love the countries they came from, embrace their additional identities. The only ones he doesn't talk about, and the only ones he is condemned for doing the same thing, have been Jews when it comes to Israel. And that is a difference. That's when you're singling out Jewish people and accusing them of dual loyalty, or blaming a Jewish person for a disagreement with another country. You don't see that in any other group. And so there are legitimate reasons to fear what a Mayor Mamdani is going to do vis-a-vis the Jewish community. I don't agree with your statement that he has been forced to say, that he's going to stand up for Jews. He's being called to account for what he has already said in the past and what he continues to say moving forward.
But he also, in that speech, talked about immigrants built New York. Mm-hmm. Immigrants helped New York become as successful as it is, and New York is a city of immigrants. Among those immigrants were Jewish people. We were right that he didn't specifically talk about the contributions of Jews, but by the same token, he didn't talk about the contribution of Indian doctors, or he didn't specifically mention ethnicities. he talked about people in general. Or is that a different? Am I listening with a different ear than what you?
He's a politician.
I think so. I think you are listening with a different ear, and that's okay, because
No,
we're all
because-
going to.
Sure.
There's not one of us on this planet that does not apply our own personal biases to what we hear, what we see, and what we do. We are all guilty of that in some way, shape, or form. And I would challenge anyone to say otherwise. And we all should be proud of who we are. And I love the notion of New York, and by extension the United States, is not necessarily a melting pot, but more of a beef stew.
Right.
We all come together, and we should be one part of the greater good. But we're not. That stew is separating. It's getting rancid. And when something's rancid, the different parts bubble to the surface in ways that are getting pretty ugly. So he might not have said exactly these things in his speech, but by extension of what he has stood up for in the past, what he has said, he has supported Hamas, and he did it immediately after October 7th. Where all of a sudden, an attack on civilians, 1,200 dead people, grandmothers, children murdered, etc., is somehow justified because of policies of a government. It's not about that. It's about vilifying a nation and by extension a people. And I don't have a problem with individuals and organizations who are going to hold the mayor-elect accountable and are going to watch every move that he makes and everything he says in the city where there are more Jews living anywhere else in the world other than the state of Israel. It is just that fact. So there are the people who are concerned about the mayor-elect, and I use that phrase because I oftentimes butcher his name, and I don't want to do that because I want to be respectful, are rightly to be concerned. But as a practical matter, he is going to be the mayor for the next 4 years. And I do know, and I've heard from colleagues already, and I've been on a number of calls with colleagues from New York and around the country about this very issue. They got to work with who they got right now. Mm-hmm. And so holding him accountable is what they're going to be doing. It's the same thing that I do.
Sure.
Another thing I tell my younger mentees, many of whom are a little bit more fractured politically, we've got to, disown this politician, because you know what? I've been in a place where I've had to disown a public official. It's not a good place to be in.
Right.
And I know we all know what we're talking about. But if your candidate of choice doesn't win on election night, shed a few tears, but then on Wednesday morning, get up, get a cell number, make a phone call, congratulate the winner, and do your job. We need to see more of that. So we are seeing that in New York.
Right.
But there are a lot of other things about the mayor-elect that a lot of people are concerned about that has nothing to do with what I will term as blatant anti-Semitism. It has to do with the policies, economic and otherwise, that he's proffering for the city that are causing a big uproar.
Sure.
And that has nothing to do with the Jews, but guess what? The Jews are being blamed for that too. On the Monday before Election Day, somebody asked me, what do you think is going to happen in New York? I'm like, Mamdani's going to win. There's no question. And well, is there any chance that Cuomo could win? I'm like, probably not, but I'm going to tell you, either way, we're going to be blamed for it. And, and that's happening, and we're seeing that. And so we're going to lose either way on that front, but it just remains to be seen. It's a touchy situation. The last thing I'll say on the Mamdani topic is when people start turning it around and suggesting that it is only because the man is a Muslim, as opposed to his policies, that's when we start getting into problems. The Jewish community nationally opposed some of the policies of President Obama, even though nationally Jews overwhelmingly voted for President Obama, and admittedly I was one of those people. So sorry, whoever might disagree with me on that. But President Obama was a very smart, intelligent, terrific president in many ways. He also proffered policies with which we had tremendous disagreements, and we spoke out against them and spoke directly to him and to members of Congress, urged them to vote against it, and we lost on some of those things. And when we got accused of being racist, it was really challenging because it had nothing to do with the president's race, which unfortunately became an issue for others. I think we need to be very careful on how we're criticizing the criticizers. And we're seeing that now, certainly with the mayor-elect in New York. We saw it with President Obama, who was absolutely subjected to racist tactics throughout his presidency and beyond. And so we just need to be careful and understand the source of criticism, the source of controversy, the source of conversations. Because if we lose the ability to talk to each other, then I think we've lost our democracy. And you alluded to that, certainly in your comments
and I think your points about accountability, that accountability in New York doesn't just fall to the Jewish community.
Yeah,
that needs to fall to the entire community who is concerned for a variety of reasons about what's happened there. I have family that lives in New York City, my sister and her family, and we were texting on election night, and I said, I hope you didn't vote this particular way. And, and I think there's concern beyond the Jewish community about that situation.
There are a lot of Catholics in New York City, and one of the most prominent being the Archbishop.
Right, absolutely.
And who's now found himself at loggerheads with the Pope, but that's a topic for another day.
I'm not going to touch that.
But what was your sister's reaction to having Muslim immigrant who is now going to be the mayor of New York City?
Well, we really didn't get into that. I mean, it was just sort of a couple casual texts, and we haven't had a chance to talk in person or on the phone or anything like that. So I really can't answer that.
Okay.
But, my sense is that, there's just a genuine concern by many in the city of the direction of where things are headed. And also where things have been. I mean, the recent history of political leadership in New York has not been all that stellar either. You speak of the immigrant, and just on the way down here today, the Catholic bishops made a very rare and public statement about immigration that's pretty compelling, and I think it's going to get a lot of press. So, and obviously you have a very prominent Catholic Archbishop in New York, and it'll be interesting to see how the mayor and the Archbishop and the Jewish leaders and everybody, how they all figure out how to get along in New York. Because I think why New York is important for the rest of us across the country is that what happens there will happen elsewhere, and it's the largest city in many ways. It's the bellwether of how things occur in many cities, and I think we look to New York for leadership at times, and this is a time when we have a lot of doubt about what's happening in a big city like that. So.
Well, finally, I'd like each of you to, as community leaders, to talk about how we address this problem of anti-Semitism, especially in the context of social media, where there are no guardrails, where there are no standards, where, unlike legacy media, unlike newspapers that I had for almost 50 years, where you had to adhere to standards that were set out in law because of the libel law. As I like to joke that the most prominent member of the staff of the Vindicator was our lawyers, because they were the ones who kept us out of trouble. But those don't apply to social media. They don't apply to the internet. So how do you, as community leaders, address this? Bonnie?
Well, I'm going to take issue with one thing you said, and I think the legacy media today is also part of the problem. I agree with you that the standards are very different when it comes to social media, but I happen to be friends with the managing editor of the New York Times. He was a college friend. Mm-hmm. And we became very close as college journalists. And the university that I went to had a daily newspaper and it was independent from the university. Sure. The only thing that it shared with the university was the name on the masthead. But other than that, we were an independent corporation. We came out Monday through Friday during the academic year. We had to adhere to all the standards the same as any normal paper. And at the time, we were the only morning newspaper in the city where I went to school, which was in upstate New York. And because we were a bunch of college kids, we were a bunch of idiots, we stayed up till 3 a.m. every day and had the late night sports scores from the West Coast because, in the olden days, I don't know, who's going to be watching this, but in the olden days, as you recall, there was no internet. You didn't know who won the baseball game on the West Coast until later in the day, and we stayed up and had all those scores. So people actually read our paper. And this individual, who's now managing editor of the New York Times, was the editor-in-chief of the paper when I was an assistant managing editor at the time. We worked very closely together. And I've called him to task on just the push notifications I get from the New York Times. It was particularly egregious after October 7th and beyond. And when I see, this is another conversation for another time, but when Palestinians living in Gaza who are speaking out against Hamas are being shot in the street before speaking out against Hamas and looking for a better life for themselves, one that I pray that they get, and I know many Israelis are praying for that as well. The push notifications we get are so different. Are those notifications wrong? Are they libelous? Not necessarily, but they are directed in a way that is, we're a legacy media organization, and it's not just the New York Times, it's others, but where a legacy media organization is throwing its hands up and not adhering to the former standards, but figuring out a way to, fly as close to the sun as they can, without burning their wings. So how do we deal with this moving forward? It's not easy. It's a challenge. Talked a little bit about, earlier about the education. The education is crucial. The calling out, for what it is. I can tell you that there was a local incident that was really very troubling and didn't get the media attention it should have. And there was a reporter there the whole time, a speaker at YSU, an academic who made a presentation about why Israel is not committing genocide. It was an academic presentation. People were, of course, free to disagree with it. The group that came in was large. It was organized. They shouted him down. They fake coughed. They crushed water bottles. They, when the speaker mentioned the sexual violence that occurred on October 7th, that was proven to be untrue. How dare you say that? That one really hurt. None of that was mentioned in the article. What was mentioned in the article was, that people took issue with the speaker. It was a picture on the front page of some of the students after the speech, or maybe before it, I don't know when it was taken, who were standing outside in a, quote, peaceful protest because they took umbrage with what the speaker said. They were entitled to do that, and standing outside was peaceful, but they sure as heck were not peaceful inside. And there were members of the community who were scared. They felt threatened, and when they left because they couldn't take it anymore, they were shouted down and cursed at just for not wanting to stay and continue to be threatened by the people who are now yelling at them. I think that we need to make sure people are educated about that. We need to continue to teach about the Holocaust and teach about hatred. And one by one, cut into the disinformation and cut into the misinformation and make people realize that, social media is great. I shop on social media. I connect with people I haven't seen in a long time on social media. There's a lot of benefits to it, but that isn't how we should, guide our lives. And as we start dealing with that, maybe one by one, person by person, and it's going to take generations, I think, we can start making a change. And lastly, what I need to stress is that people need to speak up. We talk about in Holocaust education people who were upstanders, righteous Gentiles who were honored at Yad Vashem in Israel, people who stood up for something that was right. We're seeing so little of that. Maybe they're thinking it or they're reading this stuff and, oh, that's horrible. But Scott is here standing up for it. He's speaking out against it. We need more people to continue to do that in real time.
And Scott, to that point, I was here during the closing of the steel mills, and the interfaith dialogue and the various religions got together because of the economic fallout from the closing of the mills. And you had the bishops, and you had the clergy, and you had the Jewish, the rabbis, all getting together, forcefully speaking about what the future should be, what's going on with this community, how we should help those who've lost their jobs. I mean, we used to cover it on a daily basis because there was always something. Is that the kind of response we need now to address this issue?
Well, it would surely help. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, whether it's this topic or a whole host of other community issues we haven't even covered today, I think that kind of dialogue would be critical. I mean, when we look, just as Bonnie points out, the social media, I mean, you got to be careful of what you're reading and what you're watching and what you're liking. I mean, this proliferation of what you can now do with videos and AI, and, they can take Bonnie or me or you and somehow put a video together, and it looks like we're the ones speaking, and it really is all fabricated. I saw a video today, and it said afterwards, this was generated by AI. But if you take the clip of the prominent figure that was portrayed in this AI segment and what that figure was, what they had made him say, and you share that, or look, someone's going to say, well, so-and-so said that. What's totally a fabrication. And I think between what it gets posted on social media and the proliferation of what we're seeing, even in the recent weeks and months, with what you can do with AI on social media, what is real and what isn't. And I think that's a real danger, at least on the social media side, as we move forward. So that makes even the kinds of things you're talking about with real dialogue that much more important. And I do think in this community, I mean, we've seen that wane over the years. You had that strong, you had the Council of Churches, you had all these groups that, would come together for these common problems that we had, mostly economic, over most of our lifetimes. And we're not seeing that today. I mean, look at what we've seen happen, at the local level, in the city and the county and other places. I mean, we could go on for days about, that's why we've had so many podcasts, Bertram. All these things that should be occurring that aren't. And those of us who are speaking up.
And I think that's the reason I wanted to do this. And very frankly, I'm also going to do a podcast on the rise of Islamophobia and the hatred of Muslims, because, as I said, I've got family in England and they see it. I have friends who are Muslims around and Palestinians and all who themselves are experiencing stuff, things that are happening to their families and the danger they are in. But you're right. I mean, I as you were speaking, I'm thinking we almost need a quick response team somewhere, that when these things come up, like when those texts from the Republicans about Hitler, there needs to be an immediate response, a community-wide response that says this is wrong, this cannot stand. And I don't know where that starts.
But I don't know. I think we're both sighing those things. I mean, I don't know even what that will do. I go back to what Bonnie was saying, that it is rooted in education. Education in the home, education in schools, education by members of a community who call people out one-on-one and say, we can't tolerate this. I do think it is groups, civic groups like Rotary clubs, who come together apolitically for a common cause to help others, and it's not just Rotary, but groups like Rotary clubs who are about service and about getting the right message out and doing the right things by other people and treating people appropriately, is how you combat that. And it may be small groups and it just gets bigger and bigger. But I think we're fooling ourselves to believe that, if we just stand up and call it out, Bertram, that it's going to change everything. Now, this is a daily battle where people have to be focused on, really changing how we educate people and how we raise awareness about history, how we teach history, how we don't sugarcoat history, how we don't whitewash it. There are ugly things in our history as Americans, and we can't deny those things, and we can't forget about them. We have to teach them, as painful as they may be, so that people in these future generations have a better understanding of who we are.
And it also takes political leadership and strong political leaders. We've known some, but right now it almost seems as though politics has become a one person some game where you sort of try and protect your position, protect yourself, and don't want to stand up and speak out. And that's also disturbing. And that'll be a discussion some other time about politics and where we are politically. But Bonnie and Scott, thank you very much. And I'm glad I've known you a long time so that I picked the right people to come and talk about this.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I'm hopeful that, this will sort of engender some kind of response in the community. I want to thank you again for coming and talking about the Catholic Church. I got a lot of response, as you did. A funny story that Scott was telling me. As we were coming up, he had a chance to talk to a Catholic priest who had watched the podcast I did with Scott. And he says to Scott, "I didn't know Bertram was a Catholic. I didn't know he went to Catholic school, a Catholic college."
Did that help or hinder your position?